The blood that pooled beneath Ananya Patel's unconscious body on the marble floor of her Richardson, Texas home contained DNA evidence that would later reveal she was carrying an 8-week-old fetus when her husband Rajesh Sharma struck her with enough force to fracture her skull and terminate both her life and the pregnancy that had triggered his murderous rage just minutes after learning the child was not his own. Ananya had arrived in Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport just 6 months earlier as a hopeful 27-year-old bride, clutching her new American passport and traditional red sari, while dreaming of building a successful marriage with the Indian-American IT consultant whose family had arranged their union through carefully negotiated discussions between relatives who believed they were creating the foundation for mutual prosperity and happiness. The secret that Ananya carried from Ahmedabad to Texas was carefully concealed within medical records that she had deliberately left in India, hoping that distance and time would allow her to reveal her pregnancy gradually, while building trust with her new husband, who had specifically requested a bride without any previous romantic entanglements that might complicate the traditional matrimonial arrangement. The cultural expectations that surrounded Ananya's arranged marriage included assumptions about purity and faithfulness that made her pregnancy an unforgivable betrayal in Rajesh's mind, despite the fact that the relationship with her former boyfriend Vikram had occurred before any marriage negotiations had begun and represented her last connection to a life of personal choice rather than family obligation. The violence that erupted in their suburban Richardson home on March 21, 2024, was witnessed by neighbors who heard screaming through the thin walls of their townhouse complex, though cultural barriers and assumptions about domestic disputes prevented immediate intervention that might have saved Ananya's life and preserved evidence of the systematic abuse that had escalated during her 6 months in America. The medical appointment that precipitated the fatal confrontation was intended to be a routine checkup for what Ananya had claimed was fatigue and nausea related to adjusting to American food and climate, but Dr. Emily Rogers' examination revealed unmistakable signs of pregnancy that contradicted the timeline of Ananya's marriage and created immediate questions about paternity that triggered Rajesh's violent response. The community pressure that had surrounded the couple's marriage arrangements included expectations that any problems would be resolved privately through family mediation rather than involving American authorities who might not understand the cultural complexities of arranged marriages and the importance of maintaining family honor within the Indian-American immigrant community. The investigation that followed Ananya's death revealed a pattern of escalating domestic violence that had been carefully concealed from friends and community members who admired Rajesh's professional success and apparent devotion to traditional values, while Ananya's isolation in a foreign country prevented her from seeking help from anyone who might have understood her desperate situation. The forensic evidence that emerged from the crime scene painted a picture of premeditated violence that extended beyond a momentary loss of control, with signs that Rajesh had researched methods of inducing miscarriage and had been systematically poisoning Ananya's food with herbs and medications designed to terminate her pregnancy without her knowledge or consent. The cultural tensions that complicated the investigation reflected broader issues within immigrant communities where traditional values sometimes conflicted with American legal standards regarding domestic violence, women's rights, and the protection of vulnerable individuals who might be isolated by language barriers and limited understanding of available resources. The family dynamics that had enabled Rajesh's abuse included pressure from community elders who prioritized maintaining appearances over protecting Anya's safety, with religious and cultural leaders who counseled patience and submission rather than encouraging her to seek help from law enforcement agencies that were equipped to provide genuine protection and legal recourse. The courtship between Ananya Patel and Rajesh Sharma was conducted entirely through traditional family intermediaries who exchanged photographs, academic transcripts, and financial documentation, while the prospective bride and groom were permitted only supervised conversations that focused on practical compatibility rather than emotional connection or personal desires that might complicate arranged marriage negotiations. The background investigation that Rajesh's family conducted into Ananya's suitability as a bride included extensive inquiries about her education, family reputation, and moral character, though these investigations failed to uncover her relationship with Vikram Mehta, a fellow accounting student whose affections had provided Ananya with her only experience of romantic love before family pressure forced her to end the relationship. The pregnancy that resulted from Ananya's final intimate encounter with Vikram occurred just 3 weeks before her engagement to Rajesh was formally announced, creating a timeline that would later become crucial evidence in understanding the psychological pressure that drove her to conceal her condition, while hoping that time and distance might provide opportunities for honest disclosure. The visa application process that brought Ananya to Texas was expedited through Rajesh's established residency status and his family's connections within the Indian-American business community, with immigration officials having no reason to question the legitimacy of an arranged marriage that appeared to follow traditional patterns of family-negotiated unions between educated young people. The wedding ceremony that took place in Ahmedabad during December 2023 was attended by over 400 guests, who celebrated what appeared to be an ideal match between families of comparable social standing, though Ananya's emotional distance and nervous behavior were attributed to natural shyness rather than the anxiety of someone concealing a life-changing secret. The transition to life in Richardson involved careful planning by Rajesh's mother, who had prepared an apartment with traditional Indian furnishings and arranged for Ananya to be introduced to other recent immigrant wives who could provide guidance about adapting to American customs while maintaining cultural identity and family values. The early weeks of marriage were marked by Rajesh's attempts to establish dominance through control over Ananya's daily activities, financial access, and communication with her family in India, though his behavior was presented as protective concern for her welfare rather than the systematic isolation that characterizes domestic abuse patterns. The medical symptoms that Ananya experienced during her first month in Texas were initially attributed to homesickness and dietary adjustments, though her persistent nausea and fatigue gradually raised questions that she deflected through claims about stress and the challenges of adapting to a foreign country where she had no independent social connections. The social integration that Rajesh demanded included participation in community events, where Ananya was expected to demonstrate her worthiness as his wife, while avoiding any behavior that might generate gossip or criticism from other families who were monitoring the success of their arranged marriage as a model for their own matrimonial negotiations. The financial control that Rajesh exercised included monitoring all of Ananya's purchases and requiring detailed explanations for any expenses that exceeded basic necessities, creating economic dependence that prevented her from seeking medical care or personal services that might have revealed her pregnancy before she was emotionally prepared for disclosure. The cultural expectations that governed their relationship included assumptions about physical intimacy that made Ananya's pregnancy increasingly difficult to conceal, as Rajesh began to question her reluctance to engage in sexual activity that might reveal her condition, while also expecting the enthusiastic participation of a grateful new bride. The isolation that Ananya experienced in suburban Texas was intensified by language barriers that limited her ability to communicate with neighbors or service providers who might have noticed signs of abuse or provided information about resources available to women in distressed marriages who needed protection from violent partners. The escalation of Rajesh's controlling behavior during February 2024 included systematic monitoring of Ananya's phone calls, internet usage, and social interactions, with digital surveillance that was presented as normal protective measures for a young woman adjusting to life in a foreign country where cultural differences might lead to misunderstandings or dangerous situations. The physical symptoms of Ananya's pregnancy became increasingly difficult to disguise during her second month in Texas, with morning sickness that she attributed to American food sensitivities while secretly researching pregnancy information through deleted browser histories and anonymous online forums where other women discussed similar situations. The psychological pressure that Ananya experienced included growing anxiety about the impossibility of maintaining her deception, while also dealing with Rajesh's increasing demands for physical intimacy that would inevitably reveal her condition, creating a psychological crisis that manifested in depression and withdrawal that Rajesh interpreted as ingratitude and disrespect. The community interactions that Rajesh orchestrated included dinner parties where Ananya was expected to demonstrate her culinary skills and social grace, while he monitored her conversations for any signs of disloyalty or inappropriate disclosure of private family matters that might damage his reputation within their tight-knit immigrant community. The medical appointment that Dr. Emily Rogers recommended was prompted by Ananya's complaints about persistent fatigue, and digestive issues that seemed excessive for normal cultural adjustment, though the examination was scheduled only after Rajesh's permission was obtained, and he insisted on accompanying his wife to ensure proper communication with medical professionals. The discovery of Ananya's pregnancy during the routine examination created an immediate crisis when Dr. Rogers informed the couple that the fetal development indicated conception had occurred approximately 2 months earlier, making it impossible for Rajesh to be the biological father given their recent marriage and his knowledge of their limited physical intimacy. The confrontation that erupted in Dr. Rogers' office involved Rajesh's accusations of infidelity and betrayal spoken in Hindi, preventing the medical staff from understanding the severity of the situation, while Ananya's attempts to explain the circumstances were interrupted by his growing rage and threats of consequences that would restore his honor and punish her deception. The drive home from the medical appointment was marked by Rajesh's silent fury that intensified Ananya's terror, as she recognized the cultural implications of her exposed secret and the likelihood that his response would involve violence that extended beyond personal punishment to include protection of family reputation and community standing. The phone calls that Rajesh made immediately upon returning home included conversations with his parents and community elder Mr. Bhatt, who counseled immediate action to minimize scandal, while ensuring that Ananya's betrayal would not reflect poorly on his family's judgment in arranging what had appeared to be a suitable marriage between compatible individuals. The attempts at explanation that Ananya made during their final conversation were rejected by Rajesh, whose wounded pride and cultural conditioning prevented him from considering forgiveness or understanding of circumstances that had occurred before their marriage arrangement began, instead viewing her pregnancy as definitive proof of moral corruption that justified extreme measures. The violence that erupted during their confrontation escalated from verbal abuse to physical assault when Ananya refused to agree to an immediate abortion that would eliminate evidence of her infidelity, with her resistance interpreted as continued defiance that required forceful correction through methods that ultimately proved fatal to both mother and child. The neighbors who heard the disturbance through shared walls later testified that the shouting and crashing sounds continued for approximately 20 minutes before silence fell over the apartment, though cultural hesitation about interfering in domestic disputes prevented anyone from calling police until several hours had passed without any signs of life. The crime scene that police discovered when they responded to welfare check requests revealed evidence of prolonged violence that extended beyond the fatal blow that caused Ananya's skull fracture, with signs of previous physical abuse including healed bruises and injuries that suggested a pattern of escalating domestic violence that had been carefully concealed from outside observers. The forensic examination that Dr. Sarah Martinez conducted revealed that Ananya had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object, while the 8-week-old fetus showed signs of previous stress that suggested attempts at inducing miscarriage through chemical means prior to the fatal assault. The evidence collection process included documentation of the blood-stained marble statue that had been used as the murder weapon, with fingerprint analysis confirming Rajesh's handling of the religious artifact that his family had given to the couple as a wedding gift, intended to bring blessing and protection to their matrimonial home. The autopsy results revealed toxic levels of pennyroyal and tansy in Ananya's bloodstream, herbs known for their abortifacient properties that had been administered in increasing doses over several weeks without her knowledge, indicating premeditated attempts to terminate her pregnancy that escalated to murder when the poisoning failed to achieve desired results. The digital evidence recovered from Rajesh's computer and phone included extensive internet searches about herbal abortion methods, legal penalties for adultery in various jurisdictions, and methods for disposing of evidence related to domestic violence cases, demonstrating calculated planning that contradicted claims of momentary loss of control. The interrogation of Rajesh was conducted by Detective Mark Hernandez, whose experience with domestic violence cases enabled him to recognize the cultural factors that complicated prosecution, while maintaining focus on the legal aspects of premeditated murder that transcended any traditional justifications for violence against unfaithful wives. The community pressure that emerged following Rajesh's arrest included efforts by prominent Indian American families to characterize the incident as a private matter that should be resolved through traditional mediation rather than American criminal justice proceedings that might create negative publicity for their immigrant community. The witness testimony that supported the prosecution case included statements from Dr. Emily Rogers about the couple's behavior during the medical appointment, neighbors who had heard previous arguments, and community members who had observed signs of Ananya's isolation and fear during public gatherings. The defense strategy, employed by Rajesh's legal team, attempted to minimize his culpability by emphasizing cultural factors that allegedly justified his emotional response to discovering his wife's infidelity, while also questioning the reliability of forensic evidence and suggesting that Ananya's death had been accidental during a domestic dispute. The victim advocacy that emerged in support of Ananya included efforts by women's rights organizations to ensure that cultural considerations did not excuse or minimize the severity of domestic violence, while also providing education about resources available to immigrant women who might be trapped in abusive relationships. The media coverage of the case brought attention to the complex intersection of cultural traditions and American legal standards regarding domestic violence, highlighting the vulnerability of recent immigrants who might be isolated from support systems and unfamiliar with available protections under United States law. The psychological evaluation that was conducted as part of the legal proceedings revealed personality disorders and control issues that explained Rajesh's capacity for systematic abuse while maintaining a public facade of respectability, providing insight into the warning signs that might have protected Ananya if they had been recognized earlier. The trial of Rajesh Sharma for the first-degree murder of his wife Ananya attracted significant media attention that highlighted the complex cultural dynamics surrounding arranged marriages, domestic violence, and the challenges faced by immigrant women who might be trapped between traditional expectations and American legal protections that could provide genuine safety from abusive partners. The prosecution's case was built around the systematic nature of Rajesh's abuse and the premeditated attempts to poison Ananya before resorting to fatal violence, with forensic evidence demonstrating that her death had been the culmination of weeks of calculated efforts to eliminate both his wife and the evidence of her alleged infidelity. The testimony provided by Dr. Emily Rogers was crucial in establishing the timeline of events that led to Ananya's murder, with detailed medical records documenting the couple's behavior during the pregnancy discovery and professional observations about the immediate escalation in tension that followed the revelation of paternity issues. The defense team's strategy focused on cultural mitigation arguments that portrayed Rajesh as a victim of overwhelming emotional trauma caused by discovering his wife's alleged betrayal, while also attempting to characterize the fatal assault as an unpremeditated response to extreme provocation rather than the culmination of systematic abuse. The expert testimony about domestic violence patterns provided context for understanding how cultural isolation and economic dependence had trapped Ananya in an increasingly dangerous situation, while also explaining the psychological mechanisms that enabled abusers to maintain public facades while systematically terrorizing their intimate partners. The victim impact statements presented during the trial included emotional testimony from Ananya's sister Priya, who had traveled from India to seek justice for her murdered sibling, while also providing crucial information about the deceased woman's previous relationship and the circumstances that had led to her pregnancy. The community testimony revealed conflicting perspectives within the Indian American immigrant population, with some members supporting Rajesh's claims about cultural betrayal, while others condemned domestic violence regardless of the circumstances that might have triggered male anger about female infidelity or deception. The forensic evidence presented during the trial included detailed analysis of the herbal toxins found in Ananya's system, demonstrating that the poisoning attempts had been ongoing for several weeks and required knowledge of traditional medicine that Rajesh had acquired through internet research and consultations with practitioners in India. The psychological evaluation results provided insight into Rajesh's personality structure and the factors that had contributed to his capacity for systematic deception and violence, including narcissistic traits and cultural conditioning that viewed women as property whose value depended entirely on sexual purity and obedience to male authority. The sentencing phase of the trial focused on determining appropriate punishment that would reflect both the premeditated nature of Ananya's murder and the aggravating factors involving domestic violence, cultural abuse, and the killing of an unborn child who had been an innocent victim of adult conflicts and cultural expectations. The jury deliberation required careful consideration of complex cultural factors, while maintaining focus on the fundamental legal principles that prohibited murder, regardless of the personal or cultural circumstances that might have motivated the defendant's violent actions against his wife and unborn child. The verdict that convicted Rajesh of first-degree murder with special circumstances reflected the jury's conclusion that cultural considerations could not excuse or justify premeditated violence against vulnerable victims, establishing important precedent for similar cases involving immigrant communities and traditional marriage arrangements. The sentencing of Rajesh Sharma to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole sent shockwaves through the Indian American community in Texas, forcing difficult conversations about the balance between cultural traditions and legal accountability, while highlighting the need for enhanced support systems to protect vulnerable immigrant women from domestic violence. The impact on Ananya's family in India was devastating and complicated by cultural shame about the circumstances of her death, with relatives struggling to process both grief about losing a beloved daughter and anger about the cultural expectations that had contributed to her isolation and vulnerability in a foreign country. The community response included formation of support groups for immigrant women who might be experiencing domestic violence while lacking knowledge of available resources, with bilingual counselors and legal advocates working to bridge cultural gaps that often prevented victims from seeking help through American social service systems. The policy implications of the case influenced law enforcement training about cultural sensitivity in domestic violence investigations, with enhanced protocols for recognizing signs of abuse within immigrant communities where traditional gender roles and family structures might mask dangerous situations from outside observers. The victim advocacy that emerged included establishment of memorial funds in Ananya's name to support domestic violence prevention programs, specifically designed for recent immigrants who might be isolated by language barriers, cultural unfamiliarity, and economic dependence on potentially abusive partners. The educational initiatives that developed in response to the case provided information about warning signs of domestic violence while respecting cultural diversity and avoiding stereotypes about particular ethnic or religious communities that might discourage reporting or help-seeking behavior among vulnerable populations. The legal precedents established through Rajesh's prosecution influenced how similar cases would be investigated and prosecuted in the future, with clear guidelines about the inadmissibility of cultural defenses that attempted to justify or minimize domestic violence against women who allegedly violated traditional expectations about purity or obedience. The international cooperation that facilitated the investigation included coordination with Indian authorities, who provided background information about both the victim and perpetrator, as well as assistance in understanding cultural contexts that influenced the case while maintaining focus on fundamental human rights and legal protections. The psychological research that was inspired by the case contributed to enhanced understanding of how cultural factors could be exploited by abusers to isolate and control their victims, while also advancing knowledge about effective intervention strategies that respected cultural diversity while providing genuine protection for vulnerable individuals. The media coverage of the case brought sustained attention to the challenges faced by immigrant women in abusive relationships, highlighting the importance of culturally sensitive support services, while also emphasizing that cultural traditions could never justify violence against women who sought to exercise personal autonomy or had made choices before marriage. Arrangements began. The ongoing impact on the Indian American community included enhanced awareness about domestic violence, resources, and legal protections available to all residents, regardless of immigration status, with community leaders working to ensure that traditional values could be maintained without endangering vulnerable women who needed protection from abusive partners. The memorial services that honored Ananya's life provided opportunities for community healing, while also raising awareness about the warning signs of domestic violence and the resources available to women who might be experiencing similar situations in their own marriages or relationships within immigrant communities. The establishment of support networks for immigrant women experiencing domestic violence grew from recognition that Ananya's case was not unique, with other recent brides facing similar situations involving cultural pressure, economic dependence, and isolation, that made them vulnerable to abuse by partners who exploited traditional expectations about female submission and male authority within marriage relationships. The research initiatives that were funded through victim advocacy organizations contributed to enhanced understanding of the specific vulnerabilities faced by women in arranged marriages, particularly those who immigrated to foreign countries where their lack of independent social connections and unfamiliarity with legal systems created opportunities for systematic abuse and control. The legislative advocacy that emerged from the case included efforts to strengthen domestic violence protections for immigrant women, improve cultural competency training for law enforcement and social service providers, and enhance coordination between agencies that might encounter victims who were reluctant to seek help due to cultural barriers or immigration concerns. The educational programs that were developed to raise awareness about domestic violence in immigrant communities included culturally sensitive materials that provided information about legal rights and available resources while respecting religious and traditional values that were important to community members who might otherwise be reluctant to engage with mainstream American social services. The international cooperation initiatives that were supported by victim advocates included enhanced information sharing between countries about individuals with histories of domestic violence, improved protocols for investigating cases that involved cross-border elements, and strengthened diplomatic cooperation for pursuing justice in cases where cultural factors complicated traditional law enforcement approaches. The psychological treatment protocols that were developed for families affected by domestic violence. Homicides addressed the unique trauma associated with losing loved ones to intimate partner violence, while also providing specialized approaches for dealing with cultural shame and community pressure that might complicate the grieving and healing process. The technology initiatives that were prompted by the case included development of multilingual resources for domestic violence prevention and response, enhanced communication systems that could overcome language barriers, and improved coordination between databases that might help identify patterns of abuse across different jurisdictions and cultural communities. The victim support services that were enhanced in response to the case provided specialized assistance for immigrant women, while also offering practical guidance for navigating complex legal and social service systems that were often difficult to access without appropriate cultural and linguistic support from trained advocates and counselors. The ongoing monitoring of domestic violence patterns revealed that immigrant women faced unique risks that required specialized intervention strategies, with particular attention to the ways that cultural expectations and economic dependence could be exploited by abusers who understood how to manipulate traditional values for predatory purposes. The policy development that resulted from the case included enhanced training requirements for professionals who worked with immigrant populations, improved coordination between agencies that provided services to domestic violence victims, and strengthened accountability measures for addressing cultural factors that might interfere with effective protection of vulnerable women. The academic research that was inspired by the case contributed to enhanced understanding of the intersection between culture and domestic violence, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies that respected cultural diversity, while providing genuine protection for women who might be vulnerable to abuse by intimate partners. The community partnerships that were established between traditional ethnic organizations and mainstream domestic violence service providers created new opportunities for outreach and support, while also addressing cultural barriers that had previously prevented effective collaboration between communities that shared common goals of protecting vulnerable women. The long-term impact of Ananya's murder on domestic violence prevention efforts within immigrant communities extended far beyond immediate policy changes to include fundamental shifts in how cultural traditions were balanced with human rights protections, with community leaders recognizing the need to address harmful practices while preserving valuable cultural heritage. The international recognition that the case received brought sustained attention to the global problem of domestic violence against immigrant women, with organizations worldwide using Ananya's story to advocate for enhanced legal protections and support services that could prevent similar tragedies in other countries and cultural contexts. The educational impact of the case reached thousands of individuals through community programs, online resources, and media coverage that provided practical information about recognizing and responding to domestic violence, while also reducing stigma associated with seeking help from law enforcement and social service agencies. The policy changes that resulted from sustained advocacy included enhanced verification procedures for marriage-based immigration cases, improved training for consular officials who processed visa applications, and strengthened coordination between immigration and domestic violence agencies that might encounter victims in need of protection. The technological solutions that were developed in response to the case included better systems for detecting and preventing domestic violence within immigrant communities, enhanced communication networks for reporting suspected abuse, and improved databases for sharing information about individuals with histories of violent behavior. The corporate partnerships that were established enabled legitimate cultural organizations to implement better screening procedures and support systems for recent immigrants, while also providing resources for identifying and addressing domestic violence that might be disguised as cultural discipline or traditional marriage arrangements. The international cooperation agreements that were negotiated as a result of the case facilitated beneficial collaboration between law enforcement agencies, while also supporting diplomatic relationships that balanced respect for cultural diversity with fundamental human rights protections for vulnerable women. The ongoing investigation into patterns of domestic violence within arranged marriage systems revealed systemic issues that required comprehensive approaches involving traditional community leaders, religious authorities, and modern social service providers working together to protect vulnerable women while preserving valuable cultural traditions. The psychological treatment protocols that were developed through advocacy research provided specialized approaches for helping families recover from domestic violence, homicides, while also addressing the cultural and social factors that could make certain communities particularly vulnerable to exploitation by abusive individuals. The legislative achievements that resulted from sustained advocacy work included enhanced penalties for domestic violence that exploited cultural factors, improved victim compensation programs, and strengthened protection for witnesses who testified against powerful community members who had previously been able to intimidate or silence potential accusers. The victim support services that were expanded through the Foundation's work provided comprehensive assistance for immigrant women experiencing domestic violence, while also offering specialized resources for families dealing with homicide cases that involved complex cultural and legal factors. The community outreach programs that were implemented reached thousands of recent immigrants through education about domestic violence prevention and available resources, while also providing training for community leaders who might encounter women in need of protection from abusive partners. The 10-year anniversary of Ananya's murder marked a significant milestone in ongoing efforts to prevent domestic violence within immigrant communities, with comprehensive programs that had directly assisted over 3,000 women, while also contributing to policy changes that enhanced protection for vulnerable populations across multiple states and cultural contexts. The research initiatives that continued to emerge from the case advanced understanding of how cultural factors could be exploited by abusers, while also contributing to enhanced knowledge about effective intervention strategies that respected cultural diversity, while providing genuine protection for women who might be vulnerable to domestic violence. The international law enforcement cooperation that had been developed for addressing domestic violence cases involving immigrant communities evolved into permanent frameworks for sharing information and coordinating responses, with specialized units that understood cultural factors while maintaining focus on fundamental human rights and legal protections. The victim support services that had been enhanced in response to Ananya's case continued to provide specialized assistance for immigrant women, while also contributing to enhanced understanding of effective support systems that helped survivors rebuild their lives after experiencing domestic violence. The educational initiatives that had grown out of the case continued to reach new populations through programs that provided culturally sensitive information about domestic violence prevention, while also raising awareness about available resources and legal protections for all residents regardless of immigration status. The policy changes that had been achieved through sustained advocacy continued to influence law enforcement procedures and victim protection measures, while also establishing legal precedents for prosecuting domestic violence cases that involved cultural factors or cross-border elements. The technological solutions that had been developed continued to provide enhanced protection for immigrant women, while also supporting legitimate cultural organizations that needed to balance traditional values with appropriate safeguards against domestic violence and other forms of abuse. The community partnerships that had been established continued to produce innovative approaches to domestic violence prevention, while also providing resources for organizations that needed to address cultural barriers without compromising the safety of vulnerable women who might be experiencing abuse. The international cooperation agreements that had been negotiated continued to facilitate beneficial collaboration between countries while also supporting diplomatic relationships that balanced respect for cultural diversity with fundamental human rights protections for women who might be vulnerable to domestic violence. The ongoing monitoring of domestic violence patterns revealed that while specific cases like Ananya's had generated important policy changes, similar situations continued to occur within immigrant communities, where traditional practices and modern legal protections sometimes created complex challenges for victims and service providers. The psychological treatment protocols that had been developed continued to provide specialized approaches for helping families recover from domestic violence, while also addressing the unique challenges faced by communities whose cultural traditions might be exploited by abusive individuals. The legislative achievements that had resulted from advocacy efforts continued to influence policy development while also providing frameworks for international cooperation that enhanced protection for vulnerable women while supporting legitimate cultural practices that did not endanger individual safety and well-being. 15 years after Ananya Patel left her homeland in India, believing she was beginning a new life of opportunity and prosperity in Texas, only to become a victim of domestic violence that ended both her life and her unborn child's future when her husband discovered her pregnancy by a former boyfriend. Her story continues to serve as both a tragic reminder of the dangers faced by immigrant women and an inspiring example of how personal tragedy can generate lasting positive change. The Ananya Patel Memorial Foundation has become an internationally recognized institution that has directly assisted over 5,000 immigrant women while also funding research and policy initiatives that have contributed to systematic improvements in domestic violence prevention, victim protection, and cultural competency training for service providers working with vulnerable populations. The legislative changes that her advocacy helped achieve have been adopted across numerous jurisdictions and have contributed to more effective prosecution of domestic violence cases, while also providing enhanced resources for victims and their families who need support navigating complex legal systems and recovery processes that are complicated by cultural factors and immigration concerns. The international cooperation that was essential for addressing the cultural dimensions of her case has evolved into permanent frameworks for combating domestic violence within immigrant communities, with specialized units sharing intelligence and coordinating operations that have prevented numerous tragedies while also establishing protocols for protecting vulnerable women. The victim support services that were enhanced in response to her case continue to provide specialized assistance for immigrant women experiencing domestic violence while also contributing to enhanced understanding of effective therapeutic interventions that help survivors rebuild their capacity for trust and authentic relationships after experiencing systematic abuse. The technological innovations that have resulted from foundation-funded research continue to provide enhanced domestic violence detection and prevention capabilities, while also supporting legitimate cultural organizations that need to balance traditional values with appropriate safeguards against abuse and exploitation of vulnerable women. The educational initiatives that have grown out of Ananya's case continue to reach thousands of immigrant families through programs that provide practical information about domestic violence prevention, while also raising awareness about the warning signs that might indicate dangerous situations developing within traditional marriage arrangements. The relationship between her widowed sister Priya and the advocacy work that emerged from seeking justice demonstrated that healing and meaningful change were possible even after experiencing devastating loss, though the process required sustained commitment to honoring Ananya's memory while working to prevent similar tragedies. The ongoing impact of her advocacy work extends beyond individual protection to include systematic improvements in cultural competency, victim support, and domestic violence prevention that continue to evolve in response to new challenges while maintaining focus on the fundamental human rights that transcend cultural boundaries. The The story of Ananya Patel serves as a permanent reminder that while cultural traditions represent valuable heritage that deserves respect and preservation, these traditions must be balanced with fundamental human rights protections that ensure individual safety and dignity for all community members, regardless of gender or social status. Her legacy lives on through the thousands of women who have been protected by the awareness programs her advocacy made possible, the hundreds of families who have received support through foundation services, and the systematic improvements in law enforcement and victim protection that emerged from comprehensive response to her tragic death, ensuring that her suffering was ultimately transformed into lasting positive change that continues to benefit vulnerable individuals and families worldwide.